Welcome to World Talk, where we discuss a variety of issues relating to international politics and security. This series aims to facilitate discussions to better understand the developments and their implications, as well as what could or needs to be done. As always, I'm your host, Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi, Project Assistant Professor at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology of the University of Tokyo. And I've got some great news, and that is that we're now joined by Dr. Christopher Lamont, who is our new co-host for this series. So Chris, welcome.
Thank you, Rio. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be working with you on this series. So, Rio, as Rio knows, I've recently joined the Research Center for the Study of Advanced Science and Technology, RCAST, at the University of Tokyo as a kind of visiting research fellow, and we're working together on a couple of research projects. I am an associate professor of international relations at Tokyo International University down the road from the University of Tokyo. And I'm also an assistant dean for the E-Track programs, which are our majors that are taught in English here at Tokyo International University. And I've been here for 4 years. Prior to that, I was in the Netherlands at the University of Groningen for 7 years in a international relations department there. That was, I believe, probably the largest international relations department in the Netherlands. And before that, I was at the Transitional Justice Institute. I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Transitional Justice Institute at the University of Ulster in Northern Ireland. And that tells you a little bit about my kind of research focus, my research interests in primarily post-conflict justice is what I got my start, and that's where I kind of started in terms of my own kind of PhD research. I've written a lot on these issues and on transitional justice in particular. Also, for some time, co-organized a summer program in Croatia on transitional justice that took place on the island of Cres, a nice island in the Adriatic. So I'm sure this is a topic that we'll get into, but with Ryo, I'm working on something a little bit different, aviation security. This is something that I have been interested in for some time. I wrote on the law of air defense identification zones some years ago, and also co-authored a piece that looked at Libya's airports and the kind of the impact or how kind of non-state actors' control of airports opened up these airfields as kind of hubs for contact with the rest of the world, in kind of with both kind of positive and many negative aspects. So these are some of the things that I'm currently interested in and working on. And we'll be talking about more, but also hear more broadly about other issues impacting Japan in terms of kind of Japan's own foreign and security policies.
Yeah, and then that project that we're doing about civil aviation security,
Right.
it's I think we make a really good combo because you do more the sort of international law and sort of legal aspects, and I do more security stuff, and so it sort of combines sort of two, right? Because like when we look at transport security, there's that sort of gap between hard security and also international laws, and I think our combination makes a really good one. There's also one other thing that we should talk about, and that is your book.
Oh yes,
Right?
Well, thank you.
Your recent
Yeah.
book. I think I talked about it before in the previous episode, just a little bit.
Right.
But tell us a little bit about this book. What's it about?
Okay, well, this is actually what you're holding there, and kind of what's here also is the second edition of a textbook on research methods in international relations. The first edition I wrote while I was teaching at the University of Groningen, and one of the classes that I've taught a lot over the years is research methods. And interestingly, as when kind of well, not surprisingly, when students enroll in a international relations major, what they want to learn and hear about are kind of issues of war and peace, international security, kind of go straight into the material. And very few students kind of want to ask or come with the aim of asking questions about methodology or methods. But nonetheless, these were fun courses to teach because these kind of both kind of broader methodological approaches and also the research methods tools that you can use in your own research are tools that you'll need throughout or that we use um, in a variety of different contexts and in kind of being a kind of good researcher in the context of the world today, a world in which kind of we are flooded with information and we're sifting through this information to make sense and answer some very important and very pressing questions about the world today. Um, are are things that require us to ask ourselves questions about how we know and how we make sense of the world around us. So that's kind of the starting point. It's meant as a broad overview text, meaning that it kind of introduces novice researchers to kind of each stage of the research process and also gives a broad-based introduction to kind of commonly used quantitative and qualitative research methods um, that one might use in their own research.
Well, I mean, I can say it's a real good effort because you covered all the bases pretty much. And you said that it's mainly for students, but actually, I also think that it's good for some professionals as well. To sort of get back to the basics. And so it's helped me to I've got my own copy, and so
Right.
helped me to sort of remind myself about some of the key basics that I need to sort of take into account of as I'm researching my international relations and politics and so forth. Because I think in our profession it's easy to sort of go too deep into some things and lose sight of the big picture, or sort of forget some of these important basics that allow us to sort of get to some of the solutions that we want to produce. So I think so. I highly recommend this book to anyone that's doing anything relating to international politics, security, relations. So yes, read it. Okay.
Oh, thank you so
And
much.
yeah, and while we're on the topic of that, you know, when we think about international politics of today, obviously a lot is going on. And of course, we don't have time to sort of cover all the things that are going on. But what are some of the key issues that you find are most concerning or most significant? At least from your point of view.
Yeah, this is a really good question in the sense that this year has really drawn a line in a way under a kind of this an era, I guess, in international affairs that where a lot of things, a lot of the institutions that we grew up with in many ways seem to be much more fragile than many would have assumed, and kind of not getting kind of directly not going first into kind of the war in Ukraine and its impact on international politics going forward, but rather kind of starting from the point of thinking about how states are going to negotiate the ongoing pandemic, right? Where in some parts of the world there's a feeling that the COVID-19 pandemic is behind us, but in other parts of the world that's definitely not the case.
Yeah.
And and kind of the ongoing impact and the long-term impact of this pandemic now, which is kind of going into its third year in a way, um, is something that will continue to pose a number of problems, but also will bring to the fore a number of challenges um, in terms of really testing state capacity um, in many different places. And also, it's kind of relates to another kind of issue area that I've been paying attention to, and that's kind of the global kind of how the global economic order will adapt to this kind of ongoing kind of pandemic slash post-pandemic, whatever we want to call it, um, environment. And a lot of these changes would have, of course, or a lot of developments that we're seeing here, of course, preceded the pandemic, but a lack of consensus around kind of the core norms and principles surrounding the global economic order. Um, Also, kind of a changing role kind of on the part of the United States from having once been during kind of the Cold War a kind of promoter of trade among states to a state that to a country that's becoming increasingly kind of protectionist and closed when it comes to trade in many respects. And that's kind of tied, I guess, to the third issue that we have kind of seen coming back and manifesting itself in many different forms, and that's going to be kind of the interdependence of the world in terms of supply chains and the vulnerability of these supply chains. Think back; it wasn't too long ago that the kind of the ship, the Evergreen, got kind of lodged, stuck
Yeah.
in the Suez Canal, and the damage that did to global trade, kind of this one kind of vessel in a single canal. Um, but we think about these issues more broadly now, also in the context of kind of the war in between Ukraine or war in Ukraine, and the global food trade and vulnerabilities. And here you're seeing kind of knock-on effects even as far away as Japan, right,
Yeah.
in terms of food prices, and also kind of questions about energy dependency, another issue that we're talking about here a lot um, in Japan, and also kind of what future crises could do or could mean for these vulnerabilities and how to best prepare for them, which interestingly gets me back to the point you raised about transport security, that in um, many previous discussions, kind of transport security is kind of seen within its own kind of basket. Um, and these kind of interconnections between kind of transport security and other facets of security um, aren't really made explicit.
Yeah.
um, and this is now increasingly visible in 2022 and will become kind of even more visible in the coming months and years.
Yeah, and like you talked about global supply chains and the disruptions to that. And yeah, we can talk about food, that's critical, but also another one that's often been talked about is semiconductors, right?
Right.
And that has had a major impact on a lot of people. For example, you try purchasing a new computer, like let's say ordering it online, well, it's delayed. It take there's some extra time that you need before it gets delivered to your door. And even if we don't sort of face things at the individual level, right, in a
Right.
direct sense, it is going to affect us in an indirect sense in many ways, in a variety of ways. And again, if we think about the importance of semiconductors in this sort of knowledge-based society that we're living in right now, it's not just about computers or smartphones or tablets. We'll see it or we'll feel it even in transport sector. And so I think, again, as you said, things are changing, right? The trends, if they may, on surface, they may seem similar to the ones that we faced before, but still, if we look at the content and also the context, I'd arguably say that it's a lot more serious now. When we look at some of these geopolitical and geoeconomic developments that are taking place, and also issues that are taking place. Yeah,
Right. And one thing that I would like to highlight here is that that sometimes there's a kind of tendency to see kind of the digital world and the digital economy as kind of invisible, but also kind of we kind of take it for granted, despite the fact that there is a massive physical infrastructure behind this. Right, there's kind of access to rare earth minerals, as you said, kind of semiconductors, and they're in most of these economies which are dependent um, or highly digitalized, perhaps is a better way to put it, are also highly vulnerable in disruptions to either kind of semiconductors, but also a lot of the kind of the cost of the extraction of these rare earth minerals is largely invisible, and also the energy appetite of of this digital infrastructure, right? We think about kind of cloud technology as kind of invisible, right? But there is a physical infrastructure that underlies all of that, and certainly we will be thinking about this a lot more, and states will be attempting to address some of these vulnerabilities. But one of the challenges with kind of specifically semiconductors, that you've mentioned is that this is not something that you can't kind of build state capacity to produce one's own in a short time frame.
Yeah.
And these are things that'll take kind of multi-year strategies to address.
Yeah, and that's I think that sort of transition or the reconfigurations that states sort of trying to sort of undertake. That's gonna be a real challenge. Yeah, I mean we're starting to sort of move forward. Regarding COVID-19, but we're still not completely out of the tunnel yet. We're still far from that. I feel. And I think when we think of COVID-19, you talked about the impact of COVID-19. I mean, I mean, you've started traveling again. I think you went
Right.
over to the United States, for a conference. That okay, things are starting to change, but I still feel that it's gradual. As you said, a lot of there are still a lot of countries that are far behind the curve in terms of dealing with COVID-19. Just today, news broke out that North Korea has its first officially confirmed, and I stress that part, officially confirmed case of COVID-19. And if we look at the medical infrastructures and operations there, and all the other capacity problems there, that this is going to be pretty hard. I think it was so serious to the point that North Korea had to sort of announce it, right?
Right.
Although at the same time, I can sort of say that maybe North Korea announced it because they're sort of confident that they can deal with it somehow. I I'm still on the fence about how to sort of make conclusions to what's going on in North Korea. But still, again, there are countries that are behind the curve in terms of dealing with COVID-19, and unless all the countries are out, or most of the countries are out, it is going to be hard to sort of move things back to normal. And also like I still feel that things are not going to go back to the way things were pre 2019, no matter what. And that part I feel is pretty much permanent now. I can't see myself traveling as much as I did pre-COVID. Um, for a variety of reasons. And that I find that I'm in more meetings now because I've got that online infrastructure available. And so I think a lot of these norms, um, even if the restrictions, even if we sort of move past these restrictions, I still feel that the norms are going to be different, from the past. Right? Even if all the restrictions are removed, I still feel that, I am going to be zooming a lot than ever before, and so forth. So I think, again, how we make that transition is one sort of key point, and how we sort of conceptualize or sort of come to terms with how the new world is going to be. That's also another thing as well, because that also means that there's going to have to be not only political realignments and social realignments, but also economic and sort of industrial realignments as well. The demands are going to be different from the way things were like pre 2019 and so forth. So that's one thing. Well, as you know, I do a lot of stuff on some military security strategy related issues on top of the transport security related issues. And so as always, I'm that's where my eyes are most of the time. And when I look at East Asia in particular, like Northeast Asia in particular, or the countries nearby, the three countries that I'm looking at right now, or at least concerning for me right now, is China, North Korea, Russia. Well, I've been doing a whole bunch of stuff on like policy recommendations and research, concerning Japan. So naturally, I'm going to be looking at China, North Korea, and Russia. And I feel that in the last 2, 3 years, the threat levels have gone up dramatically. China, their military is still modernizing at a fast rate. The number of ships that they're commissioning, or and submarines and all the other things, the rate at which they're producing weapons are much faster in Japan. Right, that's one. On top of that, they're becoming more aggressive, and we can see that. The Taiwan issue is definitely one when we see how we see Greater Chinese aggression in there, East China Sea and or South China Sea, but also out in the Pacific Ocean as well. Particularly with the recent signing of the security agreement with Solomon Islands. And we often think, okay, Solomon Islands are small. They're not small, and they are an extremely strategic area right in between, United States, right in between, the United States and Australia. So there are a lot of concerns in China, and to me, that's still the one at the top of the list. North Korea, I've talked with you about North Korea a lot of times already, and I even had the great honor of speaking at Tokyo International University about North Korea. But North Korean military is continuing to modernize. They just had a parade a few weeks ago, and it was pretty big. In that it's not that they introduced completely new weapons. And they, of course, they only show parts of their military. They're not going to be showing off some of the other key stuff like cyber, chemical bio, or submarines and so forth. But still, they showed off their key ballistic and cruise missiles, ground vehicles, and that. And I do see incremental but nonetheless important upgrades to their military platforms. And I also see that North Korea is growingly confident. Kim Jong Un. I mean, all of the celebrations in April were about celebrating things related to Kim Il Sung, Kim Jong Un's grandfather. But Kim Jong Un, when he came out at the military parade, he was dressing just like his grandfather, and that, I guess, was a sign to say, okay, my grandfather Kim Il Sung, he made these things, and I just made them greater. That is sort of the message that I got. And so we see continued military modernization in North Korea, but also, again, when we look at the economy there, things are developing there as well. That Kim Jong Un, he's serious about developing the economy, but that doesn't mean that he's serious about sort of making society better, right? He's really about being a more hands-on leader in an authoritarian sense. So that's North Korea. And finally, Russia. Well, okay, we all know about what Russia's up to. We have the invasion of Ukraine. Um, and for me, even if that may be something that's a little bit far away from Japan, it's still a concern because if we look at what Russia's been doing in recent years, we see some military buildups in northern islands, right, or northern territories, or the Kuril Islands, otherwise known as the Kuril Islands. But we can't forget that the Russians are looking at Japan as an ally of the United States. So that also means that Japan is vulnerable or exposed to, Russian strategies in, whatever it may be. And so again, I can't see a direct war between Japan and Russia, at least for now, like say over the northern territories or whatever. But I can, for example, see Russia maybe not necessarily attacking although that's the most extreme case that I'm worried about, but at least exploiting or pressuring Japan, because of the US bases here in Japan, or because of Japan's posture towards Russia in this whole invasion of Ukraine thing, by the Russians. So they're the three things. So they're the three countries I'm worried about. But then another thing that I'll add to that is that I'm also worried about the level of cooperation and coordination between those three as well, because those three countries, well, they're getting some bad reputation in world. Um, and if we look at, for example, Russia and North Korea, they just recently started exchanging some kind of communication to say, hey, look, we're friends. And then we saw the one between China and Russia at the time of the Beijing Winter Olympics. And so unlike the Cold War, where you had sort of differences between those three, even though they were so ideologically the same, now I'm actually starting to see a lot more convergence. Even if it falls short of like something like a full-scale alliance, there are strong signs that those three countries will work with one another or help one another, or side with one another in whatever form, and that, I guess, is still bad enough. So That's how I sort of see the situation in Northeast Asia in real, so, so up in a very summarized way. You and I, we're gonna we promised to do a sequel to this episode and talk more about the implications of Japan and what Japan's gonna do. But how do you see the situation between regarding East Asia?
Well, a couple things. One, you're absolutely right to point out that there is a kind of growing degree of kind of interestingly a flexible level. I guess on the one hand, kind of flexibility and coordination, but not kind of rising to the level of an alliance or kind of a full blown pact among these countries, but in a way that's in their interest, right? Because they have kind of areas of kind of convergence and areas of divergence in terms of their own interests and their kind of own suspicions and tensions at times um, among each other. Now, one of the reasons why I guess, like, even though geographically the war in Ukraine is very far from Japan, in many respects it's very immediate, and it's kind of the war in Ukraine's impact on the future of global order, right? And you hear this being kind of emphasized, I believe most recently by the president of the European Commission um, in Japan, talking about how kind of the future of the global order is playing out in Ukraine today, in Europe today. Um, this isn't really hyperbole, right?
Mm,
This is Japan is a country in many respects, and like I said, we'll talk about Japan more specifically um, later on. But is a country that's heavily invested in this world order that kind of is broadly speaking a post Second World War global order, but really kind of came into kind of being kind of at the kind of in the early 1990s at the end of the Cold War, and kind of without these institutions and without kind of stable and predictable access to markets, and without kind of stable and predictable supplies of things like fossil fuels, um, Japan is in a very difficult position. And the extent to which this is changing is something that Japan is paying very close attention to, and also kind of the future of. Can you mention kind of Russia, China, and North Korea, but also kind of the future of U.S. engagement in in East Asia is kind of a um, was increasingly drawn into question under the previous U.S. administration, right? Which kind of um, often questioned, right? When the President Trump was questioning kind of the value of these alliances for Washington. Now, while the kind of tenor has changed under the current administration, that worldview has not disappeared from
yeah.
from from the US. So this is also something else that for Northeast Asia, right? That we should be watching closely in terms of kind of both kind of the U.S. midterm elections later on this year, but also the U.S. presidential elections coming up in 2024. Um, Especially in the context of the kind of what is ongoing now, kind of the war in Ukraine. Hopefully, there kind of it won't be kind of ongoing still in 2024, but it does seem like this is a conflict that's not going to end anytime soon.
Yeah, and while we're on topic of Ukraine, a lot I see, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I see a lot of analysis and discussions out there in social media, in the mass media, and also in academia and research, policy research, that there's this question about, okay, what are the implications on Taiwan and so forth, right? That discussion is certainly interesting and important one, but don't think that the connection is strong as a lot of people make it out to be. A lot of scholars have already said this, but I think China and Russia are working on different timetables. What we saw in Beijing in February was like almost like an endorsement or acknowledgement of one another's strategic interests. But I don't think I don't think like Russia's invasion of Ukraine you know, so meant that it was like a flag for trying to go into something about Taiwan. Um, there are, of course, strong concerns at China's possible invasion of Taiwan. There's been some leaks about this. There's been some voices from the Chinese side that are raising some concerns that the invasion of Taiwan could be sooner than later, and so forth. Although, of course, we don't know exactly when. And when we think about Taiwan, that that is definitely one of the key issues or threats to Japan. Of course, we'll talk more about Japan later on, but when we look at the United States and its work with the Asian states and regional stakeholders here, there are some questions that the United States and Japan has to ask themselves. And one is going to be about when the United States and Japan talks about working together for security of Taiwan or recognizing in the possible invasion of Taiwan by China, are we looking at a situation where it's about the United States and Japan working to defend Taiwan, or the United States, Japan, and Taiwan working for the defense of East China Sea or the Taiwan Straits? Right, those two are completely different things, and that's going to lead to completely different debates. And these are some of the sensitive things that we have to talk about a lot more. Right, not just like simply comparing, well, invasion here, what the implications to invasion of there, and so forth. I think that's one other important thing that we need to think about these things a little bit independently, right? Although I do believe that the Chinese, I wouldn't say they're thinking twice, but they are studying the situation in Ukraine to see what worked and what didn't, right? But what I do, and I think that I do know is that the Chinese absolutely hate it when people start talking about Ukraine and Taiwan at the same time. That's definitely one thing that I've noticed as well.
Right.
So there's a lot of I think we see a lot of questions, being that are sort of popping up here and there regarding what's going on, in recent months. And another thing that I often have some issues with is that you and I, we go to a lot of conferences, workshops, and seminars, and all these wonderful events, and when we talk about international politics or international security issues, it's so easy for us to start with the flashpoints, whether it be Korean Peninsula, Taiwan Straits, Ukraine, Southeast Asia elsewhere. We often talk about the flashpoints, but we often stop with the flashpoints. But I don't think that's enough. We have a lot of non-traditional security issues. We also have issues regarding hybrid warfare. We also have domestic political issues based on more sort of lines of inward-looking policies. But we see all these dots, but those dots have been there for quite a long time now, right? Since we were kids. What we do need to do is to sort of connect the dots to see what those trends are, because they're the things that are going to be moving, international politics, right? Hybrid warfare is definitely one that I'm looking at right now a lot because, you know, as as Russia's invasion of Ukraine has just proven, conflicts and invasions and so forth are not only done through militaries, right? The military is one part of it and a big part of it, but there are a lot of others such as information warfare, cyber warfare, political warfare, exploitation. Right? There's a lot of things that are taking place beneath the surface, or at least in less visible ways.
Right.
And so hybrid warfare, that's been out there for a long time, right? North Korea's been doing that for ages, right? Same as China. I just think that we have a renewed way, or some new way of conducting hybrid warfare, particularly with social media and all these other things. Like, you and I, we're sort of old enough to sort of remember the Gulf War in early 1990s, right?
And yeah, first Gulf War in '91.
Yeah, first of all, yeah, and it was on TV. We saw it almost live, and it was like, oh wow, things are changing. And our parents and our grandparents will tell us how things have changed, or how wars have
Right.
changed, or how we sort of relay information about wars have changed. It's changed even more now, right? Because I open up Twitter and I see all these short videos of what's going on, and say, well, here's a drone doing this or whatever. things have changed dramatically. And I think that's also another is that it's not just about when we study about international relations or international security, we can't just look at these hotspots and who hates who or who loves who or whatever. We also need to look at some of these underlying trends that are really almost dominating international security, right? So I guess going back to your book here a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder, if or when you publish, like, say, a third edition of this,
Yeah.
I mean, just like off the top of your head, do you
Right.
think that there's going to be major changes, like because of what we see now? I mean, this is just like published last year, so I guess
Right.
not too
Yeah.
much,
Well, I
but
think, yeah.
yeah,
I mean, there already were a lot of updates from the first edition that was published in 2015. I think a couple things related to what you were talking about there. You brought up some really good points regarding kind of continuity and change in relation to kind of what you refer to as like hybrid and information warfare. That on the one hand, um, this type of messaging itself and this kind of these types of activities are not in themselves new, that states have been engaging with this, but they had different tools, right? Whether it was
yeah,
radio or newspaper or television. But the thing is that states had a lot of control over
yeah,
over those tools, right? They could um, censor them, right? So if you think about kind of wartime Japan and the kind of the print media and kind of radio media, right? These are things that the state could control in terms of messaging. And as you mentioned today, like when you're thinking about kind of armed conflict, or even comparing interestingly to the first Gulf War, where um, what we knew about the war as it was ongoing largely came through kind of the major kind of news networks, who had reporters at places like the Pentagon,
yeah,
right? Whereas today, you have people who are kind of there, um, in on site, able to kind of record, capture images, upload those images to social media, and in a way it kind of brings like the information that's out there about the conflict, um, is both a lot greater, but it also makes it harder for states to lie in
yeah,
a way. I mean, they can,
yeah,
but as you've seen during this conflict in Ukraine, right? It's very difficult to sustain these these narratives in the context of all of this kind of these digital tools. So of course, it's not surprising that states have invested a lot in kind of manipulating the information that we see and we get kind of online, right, through social media. Whether or not it's through kind of the acquisition of kind of bots, you see this being used in
yeah,
a lot of parts of the world, to kind of get a particular kind of perspective or kind of message across, or to influence public opinion on a particular issue, and kind of determining kind of what is kind of real in a way and what's not real, is becoming increasingly difficult, and in fact, could become even more difficult in the coming years as technology moves from our ability to simply like capture what we see to things like, and you already see like really crude kind of almost comical attempts at this now, like things like deep fakes, right? In videos, like what will this mean when you add these into the mix? So it's not necessarily kind of a kind of democratization, right, of the information sphere, but rather it's one that's becoming even more murky. So like kind of um, digital awareness, kind of understanding digital research tools. Also, just understanding what type of information is out there. That's something that often we don't think about. Are all things that will shape both how we do research, right, but also how we kind of just basically understand and make sense of what's going on around us. And a lot of these tools can be very powerful, but we live in a world where there's way too much information for us to really identify trends in kind of using kind of traditional analog
Yeah.
means of doing so, right? Like even if
Yeah.
you just think about kind of all the information that is coming out about a single war right now, it is beyond the scope of kind of the ability to have people um, filter through this. So increasingly we're reliant on technology for analysis as well, and kind of what that technology is telling us. Also, kind of the biases and what we're not looking at. And one of the things that you emphasized is the importance of looking beyond kind of the flashpoints, as you said, and will this overflow of information cause us to kind of have even narrower blinders where kind of we can only process the flashpoints and kind of not pay attention to everything else that is going on, that in many respects is kind of perhaps more interesting, more important, and more consequential than what we are focusing on.
Yeah, and now that you mentioned technologies, I think another important thing to think about when it comes to technologies is that you have to look at both hardware and software,
Right.
right? For example, transport. Yeah, it's we see new airplanes or new airports. We see new platforms and infrastructures and so forth. At the same time, we also see significant modernization. Let's say in the transport sector, in terms of services, like we have new kinds of apps. Like the way in which we book tickets have changed. The way in which you navigate from one place to another has also changed. We also see a lot of IT related companies joining the transport sector. Uh, we see a lot of changes like that, right? Even in the military, right? We have recently the North Korean military parade, and Russia also had theirs recently as well. And although it's interesting to look at the new kinds of weapons these countries have, or the weapons that they're showing off, or testing, or whatever, at the same time, we also have to think about the other side of military capabilities, and that is going to be, well, in short, it's called military readiness, right? The ability for you to be able to use those tools. And that comes down to things such as, uh, you know, maintenance, supplies, um, also capability for repairs, education, training, the way you recruit, recruitment and retention, and many others, right? And so you have to think about sort of these logistical aspects, education and training aspects, to understand or to at least analyze and work out, well, what can this military actually do, right? That's something that we also have to think about. And so again, I think there's a lot of things that we need to look at and when it comes to sort of international security developments and so forth. And again, like in next episode, which is going to be like the part two of the one that we're doing now, we'll be looking at Japan and implications of Japan and what Japan's doing and what are some of the issues or the hard questions that Japan faces. But meantime, what are some things that are coming up that you're sort of keeping an eye on?
Well, of course, I mentioned I threw in kind of the United States as a additional kind of country that we should be paying attention to, and of course, U.S. President Biden is going to be visiting the region this month, and so this is definitely something um, that we will be watching, and also interestingly, of course, Biden is going to Korea as well as visiting Japan on this trip.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's I'm keeping an eye on that one because I think there's going to be a lot more that we can learn about the Biden administration, its strategy, its policies towards the Indo-Pacific, and also its allies in this region. There have been some questions about why Biden's going to Korea before coming to Japan. Um, at this point, I don't I'm not too concerned about that. I think the big factor, at least off the top of my head, and that's with the information I have right now, is that he's going to Korea because you have a new president in Korea. Now, of course, some people say, well, he hasn't met Kishida properly yet, but still, you have a new administration in Korea. There's been some years of some struggle or some ambiguity between the United States and South Korea in recent years under former President Moon Jae-in. And so I think it's more that the US wants to go over, meet the new administration in Seoul, get make sure that the alliance is intact, and to make sure that there's sort of expectations and perceptions towards the alliance are on the same page. And so I think it's more about the new administration in South Korea, not so much about sort of prioritizing, which alliance partner is more important. I don't think it's so much about that at this point. And the U.S. and Japan has proven many times over already how important partnership is, and that has stayed strong. I mean, that's one thing that we need to think about is that yeah, there's some ambiguity regarding the Biden administration, but still, it has done a lot over the last 3, 5, 10 years, and that I don't that I think both sides are very confident with. So I don't think it's that too much of an issue right now, but still, there's gonna be some. I'll be keeping an eye on what they're gonna be talking about, what they'll be talking about, and uh, hope, and also another important thing, and we talked about this before, is like, will the Biden administration, how much effort will the Biden administration put into sort of facilitating or helping, helping to build a trilateral so cooperation mechanism between United States, Japan, and South Korea? That's also going to be an important one. But anything else that comes to mind? I also had the same thing in mind as well. But what about you?
Yeah, well, I think also, I mean, kind of, I started with the pandemic, so I could also kind of close with that. I mean, there are going to be some changes announced regarding the pandemic. Travel, kind of facilitate to ease travel to Japan in particular, um, likely this summer. Um, but also the kind of the economic dislocations that have resulted from it um, are are having a really severe impact on a lot of states that Japan enjoys relatively close relations with. I mean, you can think about kind of countries like Sri Lanka, for example, and the ongoing political crisis there following the resignation of their prime minister and demonstrations that are ongoing, calling for the resignation of the Sri Lankan president. Of course,
Mhm.
recent elections and the consequences of them in the Philippines also are are of great importance for Japan and Southeast Asia. And also another question is kind of the Japan's policies towards Myanmar
Mhm.
ongoing, right? So there's a whole lot in relation to Southeast Asia and South Asia um, that that we'll be looking at kind of in the context of both countries, as I mentioned, having kind of state capacity stretched in response to the pandemic, coping with economic dislocations and inflation resulting from the kind of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and these are things that we'll probably be watching and also talking about for the rest of 2022.
Oh yeah, and probably years after that as well in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Because the impact is not always instant. Is it always comes around. It's like COVID-19. It's like COVID. 2020, early 2020 was when we felt the first punch, but now we're so starting to feel that bruise, right? In 2021 and 2022, and I think that's going to stay for some time because, like, particularly if we look at the economic ramifications, these are not short term but long term, and we feel that even when we're trying to travel.
Right.
Uh, you know, back to the states or going anywhere else. So yeah, there's a lot of things on the list that we have to think about. And what we just talked about so far over the last 40 something minutes or so, it's really just like 10% of what we normally talk about. When we meet up and talk about international politics and security and all these other kinds of stuff going on. And but that's also a good thing because now that you're the co-host here on this show, on the Rose Talk series, we've got plenty of time and opportunities to talk about all these stuff as well. In a more sort of nuance and also I guess detailed ways, right?
Definitely.
So yeah. So Chris, thanks as always. It's great talking with you. It's great to have you on as co-host. And as I said before, man, yeah, we'll be continuing to talk a lot more, right?
Definitely. I'm really looking forward to these conversations.
Yep, it's gonna be an awesome series now that you're on here. Okay, so that's it for this episode of Rose Talk. Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel as we'll be bringing you a lot more episodes, um, you know, featuring great guests and some great conversations on some important topics. relating to international security. So stay tuned, and as always, take care and stay safe.